Hello, I'm Gwen Robinson from the University of Sheffield, and I'm just going to say a few words by way of introduction to my article in the Howard Journal of Crime and Justice, which is called Rehabilitating Probation. So, to set the scene for the article, just over 6 years ago, the probation service in England and Wales was partly privatised. And in that process, 21 new community rehabilitation companies were created, and they took on responsibility for the supervision of offenders assessed as posing low or medium risk. Those CRCs were contracted out in early 2015 to 8 different providers, which were dominated by private sector interests. What remained in the public sector was reorganised and became a new National Probation Service with responsibility for services in the criminal courts, but also for supervising those offenders assessed as posing a high risk. So this was a top-down initiative of the Ministry of Justice under Chris Grayling's leadership, and it was quite strongly opposed at the time by probation staff and probation leaders, by academics, and by others with an interest in the future of the service. And those collective voices saw the splitting of the service into 2 separate parts as an illogical step, not just one that was for many ideologically problematic, but it was considered to be unlikely to deliver either economic savings or better quality services or reductions in reoffending. And 6 years on, it seems that the critics have been proven to be right. Numerous official reports and academic studies have shown that splitting the service into 2 parts has been a very expensive mistake. And following a recent consultation on the future of the service, it's now been decided to reform it yet again, this time bringing the work and the staff of the 21 CRCs into an expanded NPS with 12 geographical divisions. So what the article does is examine this ostensibly very positive policy U-turn and try to think through some of the challenges facing the reconstituted probation service. And it does that by looking at some of the research and concepts from the discipline of organisational studies, which criminologists and penologists have rarely considered. And particularly, it looks at work that's examined organisational legitimacy, understood here as how important external stakeholders or customers perceive and value organisations. And I suggest in the article that this literature shines a light on some really interesting and important questions for the probation service and its leaders as they seek to establish the legitimacy of the expanded NPS. So the organisational studies literature tends to deal with corporate bodies, corporate entities, and that creates an interesting contrast. So the leaders of corporate entities or corporate organisations tend to have managerial agency and therefore significant freedom to act and communicate on their own behalf and on behalf of their organisations. And they also tend to have fairly well-defined customers or consumers who simply need to be persuaded of the appeal and value of their products or services. But the probation service is, of course, a rather different kettle of fish. It lacks that autonomy. It lacks the autonomy of a corporate body, instead being steered by the penal state, or the MOJ to be specific. And it's embedded in a complex network of relationships. It has multiple groups of stakeholders who may have quite different needs and views about what probation ought to be delivering and how. And all of this means that when it comes to thinking about that process of legitimation in the probation context, then we need to look both at what the Ministry of Justice is proposing to do to that end, which fits in with the idea of strategic restructuring in the organisational studies literature. But also, we need to look at the opportunities and challenges that lie ahead for the new leaders of the service itself. It's well established that the management of legitimacy is reliant on effective communication. So that means we need to think about how and with whom and what those leaders will need to communicate, as well as the consequences of being part of a civil service which doesn't empower them with the kind of independent voice that the leaders of corporate organisations tend to have. So the article doesn't provide all the answers to the challenges ahead, but it does seek to expose them in what is hoped is a helpful way. And it concludes that questions around the agency and voice of the service are going to be really important if the expanded NPS is going to succeed in establishing its legitimacy as the main provider of probation services, or in other words, enabling its own rehabilitation. So thank you for listening, and I hope that if you do read the article, that you find it of interest.